Cowboy's daughter helped a Comanche boy find his family. Next day, 200 elders filled her yard with gifts. This is the extraordinary story of 16-year-old Sarah Mae Thompson, a rancher's daughter whose simple act of kindness bridged two worlds that had known only conflict for generations. You're about to witness how one moment of compassion changed the course of history in the Texas frontier, proving that courage and humanity can triumph over fear and prejudice. If this incredible true tale moves your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our inspiring stories from the American West. Now, let me take you back to the spring of 1878, to a small ranch near the Red River, where an unlikely friendship would challenge everything two communities believed about each other. The first rays of dawn painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson as Sarah Mae Thompson stepped out onto the weathered wooden porch of their ranch house. The morning air carried the sweet scent of wildflowers blooming across the endless prairie, mixed with the familiar smell of horses and cattle that had become the backdrop of her life. At 16, Sarah Mae possessed the quiet strength that came from growing up on the frontier, her auburn hair catching the early light as she surveyed the vast expanse of grassland that stretched beyond their property line like an ocean of green and gold. It was April 15th, 1878, and spring had arrived with unusual abundance in this remote corner of North Texas. The winter had been harsh, with blizzards that had tested both man and beast, but now the land was responding with an explosion of life. Blue bonnets carpeted the rolling hills, their azure blooms creating stunning contrasts against the emerald grass. Indian paintbrush added splashes of orange and red, while delicate white evening primroses dotted the landscape like fallen stars. Sarah Mae's father, William Thompson, had built their ranch from nothing 14 years earlier, when she was just 2 years old. He'd been a cavalry officer during the final years of the Indian Wars, serving under Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie in campaigns against the Comanche and other tribes. But unlike many of his contemporaries who emerged from those conflicts with hatred and contempt for their former enemies, Will Thompson had developed a complex understanding of the native peoples he'd fought against. He'd seen too much senseless violence, too many good men on both sides die for causes that seemed less clear with each passing year. He'd witnessed the courage and dignity of Comanche warriors even as he fought against them. He'd seen their devotion to their families, their deep connection to the land, and their sophisticated understanding of survival in the harsh frontier environment. These experiences had left him with a profound respect for the people his government had labeled as savage enemies. When the fighting ended and his military service concluded, Will had taken his small savings and his wife Catherine to this remote corner of North Texas, determined to build a peaceful life away from the hatred and mistrust that plagued the more populated frontier settlements. He'd chosen this location carefully, far enough from major settlements to avoid the worst of the racial tensions, but close enough to the Red River to have access to water and trade routes. The ranch was modest by Texas standards, encompassing just over 4,000 acres of prairie grassland, creek bottoms and rolling hills. But it was enough to support a herd of hardy longhorn cattle and provide a decent living for his family. Will had built everything himself, from the sturdy log house with its wide front porch to the barn and outbuildings that housed their livestock and equipment. Every board, every nail, every fence post represented hours of backbreaking labor and careful planning. Catherine Thompson had been Will's perfect partner in this endeavor. She'd been a schoolteacher back in Missouri before their marriage, educated and refined, but possessed of the inner strength necessary to thrive on the frontier. She taught Sarah Mae to read and write, instilled in her daughter the values of compassion and fairness, and helped create a home filled with love and learning despite the isolation and hardships of ranch life. But tragedy had struck 2 years earlier, when Catherine succumbed to a fever epidemic that had swept through the region. Will had ridden hard to bring Doc Patterson from the nearest town, but the physician had arrived too late to save her. Catherine's death had been devastating for both father and daughter, leaving a void in their lives that seemed impossible to fill. In the wake of their loss, Sarah May had stepped up to take on many of her mother's responsibilities around the ranch. She'd learned to cook hearty meals, tend the vegetable garden, care for sick animals, and manage the countless details that kept a frontier ranch running smoothly. More than that, she'd become her father's trusted partner in making decisions about their cattle operation, their finances, and their future. The experience had matured Sarah May beyond her years, giving her a practical wisdom and quiet confidence that impressed everyone who met her. She could ride as well as any cowboy, shoot accurately with both rifle and pistol, and handle herself in any situation the frontier might present. But she'd retained the compassion and gentle spirit her mother had nurtured, creating a combination of strength and kindness that was both rare and precious on the harsh frontier. This particular morning, Sarah May was preparing for one of her regular rides to check on their cattle herd. The spring calving season was in full swing, and she needed to make sure that all the new mothers and babies were healthy and accounted for. She'd already eaten breakfast and completed her morning chores around the house, and now she was looking forward to spending several hours on horseback in the beautiful spring weather. She walked to the corral, where Harmony, her favorite mare, was waiting. The bay was a beautiful animal, with a glossy coat that reflected the morning sunlight and intelligent eyes that seemed to understand every word her young mistress spoke. Will had given Harmony to Sarah May for her 14th birthday, and the two had developed an almost mystical connection. The horse seemed to anticipate Sarah May's movements, responding to the slightest pressure from her rider's legs or the most subtle shift in weight. As Sarah May saddled Harmony, she took special care to check all the straps and buckles. Her father had drilled into her the importance of proper equipment maintenance, emphasizing that a loose cinch or broken bridle could mean the difference between life and death on the frontier. She secured her rifle in its leather scabbard, checked her sidearm, and made sure she had adequate water and provisions for the day's ride. Just as she was preparing to mount up, Sarah May heard something that made her pause. It was a sound that didn't belong on the prairie at this time of morning, a soft whimpering that seemed to be coming from somewhere near the massive oak tree that stood about 100 yards from the house. The tree was an ancient giant, probably 200 years old, with a trunk so wide that 3 men couldn't encircle it with their arms outstretched. Its massive canopy provided shade for a large area, and both humans and animals often sought shelter beneath its branches during the heat of the day. Sarah May had learned early in life to pay attention to sounds that didn't fit the normal pattern of ranch life. On the frontier, survival often depended on noticing when something was out of place, when the usual rhythms of nature were disrupted by the presence of danger. She'd heard that sound before, but never from an animal. It was distinctly human, the sound of someone in distress. She tied Harmony's reins to the hitching post and walked carefully toward the oak tree, her hand instinctively moving to the small pistol her father had taught her to carry. As she approached the massive trunk, the whimpering became clearer, and Sarah May realized it was coming from a child. The sound tugged at her heart, reminding her of times when she'd been hurt or frightened as a little girl. Moving around the enormous trunk with careful steps, Sarah May stopped short at what she discovered. Huddled against the base of the tree, partially hidden behind some exposed roots, was a young boy. He appeared to be about 8 or 9 years old, with long black hair that hung in tangled strands around his face. His skin was darkened by sun and dirt, and his clothes were torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. But it was his footwear that immediately told Sarah May this wasn't a lost settler child. Instead of the boots that white children wore, this boy had soft moccasins on his feet, decorated with intricate beadwork that was clearly Native American in origin. His features, too, marked him as Indian, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that held both intelligence and fear. Sarah May's first instinct was to call for her father, but something in the boy's expression stopped her. He was looking up at her with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, and she could see that he was exhausted and probably hadn't eaten in days. Despite everything she'd been taught about the dangers of Indians on the frontier, despite all the stories of raids and attacks that had shaped her understanding of native peoples, her heart went out to this frightened child. The boy was clearly in bad shape. His left arm hung at an odd angle, suggesting it might be broken or badly sprained. There were cuts and scratches all over his body, some of which looked infected. His lips were cracked from dehydration, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd been surviving on very little food for an extended period. Sarah May knelt down slowly, keeping her movements gentle and non-threatening. She could see that the boy was poised to run, despite his obvious weakness, and she didn't want to frighten him further. "Hello," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you hurt?" The boy didn't respond verbally, but his eyes never left her face. She could see him trying to assess whether she represented safety or danger, his young mind probably struggling to understand why this white girl wasn't screaming or calling for armed men to come and capture him. Sarah May realized he probably didn't speak English, or at least not much of it, but she continued talking to him in a calm, soothing voice while she assessed his condition more carefully. His injuries were serious enough to require immediate attention, and his obvious dehydration meant he needed water quickly. "I'm going to help you," she said, speaking slowly and clearly. "I need to get some things from the house. Please don't run away." She held up her hand in what she hoped was a universal gesture for wait here and began to back away slowly. The boy watched her every movement, his body tense and ready for flight. Sarah May could see the internal struggle playing out in his expression, the desperate need for help warring against generations of learned fear and mistrust. Moving as quickly as she dared without alarming the child, Sarah May hurried back to the house and gathered supplies. She filled a cup with cool water from their well, wrapped some bread and dried meat in a clean cloth, and collected bandages and medicine from their medical supplies. Her mother had insisted on maintaining a well-stocked medical kit, knowing that on the frontier, people often had to serve as their own doctors. When Sarah May returned to the oak tree, she was relieved to find that the boy was still there, though he looked ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. She approached slowly and knelt down again, this time close enough to see the full extent of his injuries. She offered him the water first, and his restraint crumbled at the sight of it. He drank eagerly, though he remained wary and ready to run. The way he consumed the water told Sarah May that he'd been without adequate hydration for at least several days, possibly longer. When she showed him the food, his last defenses against hunger collapsed. He ate with the desperate intensity of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in far too long, wolfing down the bread and meat as if he feared it might be taken away from him. Sarah May watched with growing concern, realizing that this child had been surviving in the wilderness on his own for an extended period. While he ate, she examined his injured arm more closely. It wasn't broken, as she'd initially feared, but there was a deep gash that had become badly infected. The wound was several days old, and red streaks were beginning to extend from it up his arm. Sarah May had seen enough infected wounds to know that without proper treatment, this kind of infection could kill a person, especially a child who was already weakened by hunger and dehydration. She began cleaning the wound as gently as she could, using clean water and soft cloth. The boy endured the pain without making a sound, though she could see him biting his lip to keep from crying out. His stoicism impressed her, but it also made her heart ache for what this child must have endured to develop such tough resilience at such a young age. As she worked, Sarah May found herself studying the boy's face more closely. Despite his fear and exhaustion, there was an intelligence in his dark eyes that reminded her of children she'd known in the settlements. His features, while distinctly Native American, held the same basic expressions of pain, fear, and hope that she'd seen in children of all races. The realization struck her with surprising force that this boy was fundamentally no different from any other hurt and frightened child who needed help. She'd heard terrible stories about Indians all her life, tales of savage raids, brutal attacks, and merciless killings. These stories had shaped her understanding of native peoples as something less than human, as dangerous predators who threatened the safety and prosperity of white settlers. But looking at this injured child, Sarah May began to question those assumptions. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Her father was returning from his early morning ride to check on their horses in the far pasture, and she could hear Ranger, his big roan stallion, cantering toward the house. Sarah May's heart began to race as she realized she was about to face a moment of truth. How would her father react to finding her tending to an Indian child? Would he see the same hurt boy that she saw, or would years of frontier conditioning make him see only a potential threat? Will Thompson came around the corner of the house and immediately spotted his daughter kneeling under the oak tree. His experienced eye took in the scene quickly, noting the Indian child and Sarah May's position beside him. Will's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, a reflex developed through years of frontier life, but something in his daughter's calm demeanor made him pause. "Sarah May," he called out, his voice carefully controlled. "Step away from him and come here." "Papa, he's just a child," Sarah May replied without moving from her position beside the boy. "He's hurt and scared and hungry. He needs help." Will dismounted and approached cautiously, his military training making him alert for any sign of an ambush or trap. Indian raids often involve tactics designed to lure victims into vulnerable positions, and finding a lone child could be part of such a strategy. But as he got closer, he could see that the boy was genuinely alone and in no condition to pose a threat to anyone. The child's injuries were obvious and severe, and his exhaustion was genuine. This wasn't a healthy warrior using a child as bait for an attack. This was simply a lost and badly hurt boy who desperately needed medical attention. "Where did he come from?" Will asked, his voice softer now but still cautious. "I found him here this morning when I was getting ready to ride out. I think he's been hiding here all night, maybe longer. Papa, look at his arm. It's badly infected. If we don't help him, he might die." Will Thompson looked down at the Indian boy and felt a familiar conflict stirring in his chest. Everything he'd been taught by society, everything that frontier culture expected of him, said he should turn this child away, or at the very least, turn him over to the Indian agent or the cavalry. Indians and whites were supposed to be enemies on this frontier, and harboring an Indian child could bring trouble from both communities. But as he studied the boy's face, Will saw something that reminded him powerfully of his own daughter at that age. The same basic humanity, the same capacity for fear and hope that transcended race or culture. More than that, he saw in this child's condition a story of suffering that no child should have to endure, regardless of their background. His years of military service had taught Will to recognize genuine distress, and this boy was clearly in desperate straits. The infected wound alone could kill him within days if it wasn't treated properly, and his obvious malnourishment suggested he'd been surviving in the wilderness for at least a week, possibly longer. "Bring him inside," Will said finally, his decision made. "Let's see what we can do for that arm." Sarah May's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Papa." Getting the boy into the house required considerable patience and gentle coaxing. He was clearly terrified of the adult white man, and Will's size and obvious military bearing probably reminded the child of soldiers he'd encountered in less pleasant circumstances. But Sarah May's calm presence seemed to reassure him, and her gentle encouragement eventually convinced him to accept their help. They guided him to the kitchen, where the light was better and they had easy access to water and medical supplies. Will examined the boy's injuries more thoroughly, and what he found was deeply troubling. The infection in the arm was worse than Sarah May had initially realized, with red streaks extending well beyond the original wound. Without immediate and aggressive treatment, the infection could spread to the boy's bloodstream and kill him within days. In addition to the infected arm, the child had numerous other injuries that told a story of recent trauma. There were cuts and bruises that suggested he'd been in some kind of violent encounter, possibly a battle or attack. Some of the injuries looked like they might have come from bullets or other weapons, while others appeared to be from falls or collisions with rocks and trees. "Sarah May, heat up some water and get me the medical kit," Will instructed, his cavalry training taking over as he assessed the situation. "We need to clean this wound thoroughly and get some medicine into him." As they worked to treat the boy's injuries, Will found himself wondering about the child's story. How had he come to be wandering alone in the wilderness? Where was his family? What had happened to separate such a young boy from his people? The answers to these questions would help determine what they should do next, but first they needed to stabilize his condition and make sure he survived. The process of cleaning and treating the infected wound was painful for the boy, but he endured it with remarkable stoicism. He bit his lip to keep from crying out, and his only sounds were sharp intakes of breath when the pain became particularly intense. His courage impressed both Will and Sarah May, and it reinforced their growing sense that this child was no different from any other brave young person facing adversity. As the day progressed, they gradually pieced together the boy's story through a combination of his limited English vocabulary, some Spanish that Will had picked up during his cavalry service, and elaborate gestures and drawings in the dirt. The tale that emerged was both heartbreaking and frightening. The boy's name was Little Wolf, and he was indeed Comanche, as they'd suspected from his appearance and clothing. He'd been traveling with a hunting party that included his father, older brother, and several other warriors from their band. They'd been hunting buffalo and other game in the area when they were attacked by a group of white buffalo hunters who were operating illegally on Comanche land. The attack had come without warning, as the hunting party was making camp for the evening. The buffalo hunters, who were apparently well-armed and experienced fighters, had opened fire from concealment, killing 2 of the Comanche hunters immediately and wounding several others. In the chaos that followed, Little Wolf had been separated from the others and had fled into the wilderness. He'd been wandering alone for almost 2 weeks, trying to find his way back to his band's main camp. He'd survived on berries, roots, and what little game he could catch with his bare hands, drinking from streams and creeks when he could find them. The infected wound had come from a fall onto sharp rocks while he was trying to climb down a steep canyon wall to reach water. For the past 3 days, he'd been too weak to travel far, and he'd taken shelter under the oak tree, probably expecting to die there. He'd been unconscious for much of the previous day and night, which explained why he'd remained hidden, despite being so close to the Thompson house. As Little Wolf's story unfolded, Will and Sarah May began to understand the magnitude of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a lost child who needed to be returned to his people. This was a survivor of what sounded like a massacre, a witness to violence that had claimed the lives of his family members and friends. The trauma of what he'd experienced, combined with his physical injuries and the ordeal of surviving alone in the wilderness, had pushed him to the very limits of endurance. By evening, Little Wolf's fever had begun to break, thanks to the medicine they'd given him and the careful attention to his infected wound. He was able to sit up and communicate more effectively, and for the first time since they'd found him, he managed a small smile when Sarah May offered him a bowl of her mother's beef stew. The transformation was remarkable. As his immediate physical needs were met and he began to feel safe, Little Wolf's personality started to emerge. He was clearly an intelligent child, quick to understand what they were trying to communicate and eager to share information about his own people and culture. He showed them how to make certain knots that the Comanche used, demonstrated the calls they used to signal each other while hunting, and even attempted to teach them a few words in his native language. Sarah May was particularly fascinated by these cultural exchanges. She'd never had any real contact with Native Americans beyond the hostile encounters that were common on the frontier, and she found Little Wolf's knowledge and skills impressive. He knew things about surviving in the wilderness that she'd never learned, despite growing up on a ranch. His understanding of plants, animals, and weather patterns was sophisticated and practical in ways that amazed her. That evening, as Little Wolf slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, Will and Sarah May sat on their front porch discussing what they should do next. The boy's condition had stabilized, and he was clearly going to survive his injuries, but that created new challenges for the Thompson family. "What do you think we should do, Papa?" Sarah May asked, her voice thoughtful in the gathering darkness. Will was quiet for a long time, staring out at the prairie where the first stars were beginning to appear in the clear Texas sky. He was weighing options, each of which carried significant risks for his family and for Little Wolf. "The right thing would be to take him back to his people," Will said finally, "but that's going to be dangerous for all of us." "Why dangerous?" "Think about it, darling. We'd have to ride into Comanche territory, find his band, and convince them that we're not their enemies. Given what Little Wolf has told us about the attack on his hunting party, his people are probably expecting more violence from whites. They might see us as a threat before we could explain what we're doing." Sarah May considered this. "But if we don't take him back, what happens to him? If we keep him here, word will eventually get out. The Indian agent will want to know why we're harboring a Comanche child. Other ranchers in the area might see it as a sign that we're sympathizing with their enemies, and Little Wolf himself will never be truly safe or happy living among people who aren't his own. So we have to try to get him home." Will nodded slowly. "I think we do. But it's going to require careful planning and a lot of luck." The next morning, Will began making preparations for what would be one of the most dangerous journeys of his life. He cleaned and checked all their weapons, loaded the wagon with supplies, and studied the maps he had of the region to plan the safest route to Comanche territory. Little Wolf was much stronger after a full night's rest and proper food, and he was eager to help with the planning. Using his knowledge of landmarks and tribal movements, he was able to give Will valuable information about where his band was likely to be camping and the best routes to reach them safely. The boy explained that his grandfather, a chief named Standing Bear, typically kept the main band camped near sources of water during the spring months, moving locations periodically to find fresh grazing for their horses and new hunting grounds. Based on the time of year and Little Wolf's description of the area where the attack had occurred, Will was able to make educated guesses about where the band might currently be located. They would need to travel northwest for approximately 3 days, crossing some of the most remote and potentially dangerous territory in Texas. It was land that few white people had ever seen, places where Comanche hunting parties still roamed freely and where a wrong turn or misunderstood gesture could mean the difference between life and death. But Will had advantages that most white travelers in that region wouldn't have had. His military experience had taught him how to read terrain and weather patterns, how to move quietly and avoid detection when necessary, and how to assess and respond to dangerous situations. More importantly, he had Little Wolf as a guide, someone who knew the land intimately and could help them avoid areas where hostile encounters might be more likely. Sarah May insisted on coming along, despite her father's initial reluctance. She argued that Little Wolf trusted her and felt comfortable in her presence, which could be crucial if they encountered his people under tense circumstances. She also pointed out that her presence would make their party appear less threatening, as war parties typically didn't include young women. Will eventually agreed, recognizing the wisdom in her arguments, but also knowing that his daughter had inherited enough of her mother's stubborn determination that she'd probably find a way to follow them, whether he agreed or not. They set out just after dawn on what would prove to be one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of the Texas frontier. Will drove their wagon, loaded with supplies and gifts they hoped would demonstrate their peaceful intentions. Sarah May rode alongside on Harmony, her rifle ready, but her manner relaxed and non-threatening. Little Wolf sat in the wagon, scanning the horizon for familiar landmarks and serving as their guide into territory that might as well have been another world. As they traveled northwest, the landscape gradually changed from the rolling grassland around their ranch to the more rugged terrain of the Texas Panhandle. Mesas and canyons began to appear on the horizon, and the vegetation shifted from prairie grass to scrub oak, mesquite, and prickly pear cactus. It was beautiful country, but it was also harsh and unforgiving, especially to those who didn't understand its rhythms and secrets. Little Wolf proved to be an excellent guide, with an intuitive understanding of the land that impressed both Thompsons. He could read the landscape like a book, identifying sources of water from subtle changes in vegetation, predicting weather patterns from the behavior of birds and animals, and navigating by landmarks that were invisible to untrained eyes. As they traveled deeper into Comanche territory, Little Wolf became more animated, pointing out places where significant events in his people's history had occurred. He showed them a rock formation where a famous chief had made his last stand against cavalry troops, a creek where his great-grandfather had received visions that guided important tribal decisions, and a grove of trees where young warriors traditionally went to fast and seek spiritual guidance. These stories gave Will and Sarah May insights into Comanche culture that few white people had ever experienced. They began to understand that the land wasn't just territory to be claimed and exploited, but a living entity with spiritual significance, a repository of history and tradition that connected the present generation to their ancestors. On their second day of travel, they encountered their first potential danger. Little Wolf suddenly became alert and tense, pointing toward a ridge about a mile to their north. Following his gaze, Will could see dust clouds that indicated a group of riders moving parallel to their route. "Comanche?" Will asked quietly. Little Wolf studied the distant riders for several minutes before shaking his head. "No, buffalo hunters, I think. Bad men." The irony wasn't lost on Will that their greatest danger in Comanche territory might come from other white people rather than from Indians. The buffalo hunters who operated in this region were often rough, violent men who had little respect for law or property rights, whether those belonged to whites or Indians. Some of them were wanted criminals who used the remote frontier as a refuge from justice. Will changed their route to avoid the distant riders, and they spent the rest of the day traveling through more difficult terrain that offered better concealment. Little Wolf's knowledge of the land proved invaluable, as he guided them through canyons and around mesas in ways that kept them hidden from potential observers. That evening, they made camp in a secluded valley beside a clear running stream. For the first time since leaving their ranch, they were able to relax somewhat and enjoy a hot meal cooked over an open fire. Little Wolf seemed more at ease as they penetrated deeper into his homeland, and he entertained them with stories about his family and his life before the attack. He told them about his father, a respected warrior named Gray Eagle, who had taught him to ride and hunt. He described his older brother, Running Horse, who was training to become a war chief and had promised to teach Little Wolf the skills he would need as a warrior. Most poignantly, he spoke of his mother, Morning Star, who had died in a fever epidemic 2 years earlier, leaving him to be raised primarily by his grandfather, Standing Bear. The parallels between Little Wolf's story and their own family history weren't lost on Will and Sarah May. Both families had been shaped by loss, both had learned to find strength in the bonds between survivors, and both understood the pain of growing up without a mother's guidance and love. As they sat around their campfire that night, sharing stories and gradually building trust, the artificial barriers of race and culture began to seem less important than the common experiences that connected all families on the frontier. They were all people who loved their families, mourned their losses, and hoped for better futures for their children. The third day of their journey brought them into the heart of Comanche territory, and Little Wolf's excitement became almost palpable. He recognized landmarks that meant they were approaching areas where his band commonly camped, and he began to show signs of the anticipation that comes with nearing home after a long and dangerous absence. Around midday, Little Wolf suddenly stood up in the wagon and pointed excitedly toward a column of smoke rising from behind a distant ridge. It was the thin, steady smoke of cooking fires, distinctly different from the heavy black smoke that would indicate a grass fire or burning buildings. "Standing Bear," Little Wolf said, his voice filled with joy and relief. "Grandfather." They approached the source of the smoke carefully, with Will keeping his weapons ready but not obviously threatening. As they crested a low hill, they could see down into a valley where a substantial Comanche camp was spread along the banks of a meandering river. There were at least 40 teepees arranged in the traditional circular pattern, with hundreds of horses grazing in the nearby meadows and people moving about their daily activities. It was Sarah May's first glimpse of a Plains Indian village, and the sight took her breath away. The teepees were beautiful, decorated with painted designs and symbols that told stories of their owners' achievements and spiritual beliefs. Children played in the spaces between the lodges while women worked at various tasks, their clothing bright with beadwork and quillwork. Men tended horses or worked on weapons and tools, their movements efficient and purposeful. Little Wolf could barely contain himself at the sight of his home. He would have jumped from the wagon and run toward the camp if Will hadn't caught his arm and reminded him that they needed to approach carefully to avoid being seen as a threat. "We need to let them know we're coming peacefully," Will said. "Can you call out to them?" Little Wolf nodded eagerly and cupped his hands around his mouth, letting out a series of calls in his native language. The sound carried clearly across the valley, and within moments people in the camp were responding, their voices raised in what sounded like cries of amazement and joy. The reaction in the camp was immediate and dramatic. People stopped what they were doing and looked toward the source of Little Wolf's voice. Several men ran to get horses, while women and children gathered in groups, pointing and talking excitedly. Within minutes, a party of riders was galloping toward them across the valley floor. Will's military instincts told him to prepare for a fight, but the way Little Wolf was bouncing with excitement suggested that these riders were coming to welcome rather than attack. Still, Will kept his rifle ready and positioned himself to protect his daughter if the situation turned dangerous. The riders reached them quickly, surrounding their wagon in a cloud of dust and excited voices. Little Wolf was shouting in Comanche, and the warriors were shouting back, their voices filled with emotions that needed no translation. Relief, joy, and overwhelming happiness transcended the language barrier. One of the riders, clearly Little Wolf's father based on their resemblance, dismounted and swept the boy into his arms, tears streaming down his weathered face. The warrior held his son tightly, speaking rapidly in their native tongue, his voice breaking with emotion. Other family members crowded around, touching Little Wolf as if to convince themselves that he was real and alive. An older man, distinguished by his elaborate war bonnet and the obvious respect shown to him by the others, approached Will and Sarah May. This was clearly Standing Bear, Little Wolf's grandfather, and the chief of the band. He was a man in his 70s, with long grey hair braided with eagle feathers and beads, and eyes that held both wisdom and careful assessment. Standing Bear studied the Thompsons for a long moment, taking in their peaceful demeanor and the obvious care they'd shown for his grandson. When he spoke, it was in accented but clear English, learned during decades of dealing with traders, soldiers, and government officials. "You bring back Little Wolf," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of profound gratitude. "Yes, sir," Will replied respectfully, recognizing the dignity and authority of the man before him. "We found him near our ranch, injured and lost. We took care of him and brought him home to you." Standing Bear's eyes moved from Will to Sarah May, studying her face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read character in human features. Sarah May met his gaze without flinching, her own eyes reflecting the same honesty and compassion that had led her to help Little Wolf in the first place. "Why you do this?" Standing Bear asked, his question directed at both of them, but his eyes focused on Sarah May. "Your people and my people, we have been enemies for many generations." Sarah May spoke up before her father could answer, her voice clear and strong despite the intimidating circumstances. "Because he was a child who needed help, and that's more important than whether we're supposed to be enemies." Standing Bear's weathered face remained impassive for several long seconds, but Sarah May thought she saw something shift in his eyes. Finally, the hint of a smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. "You have wisdom for one so young," he said, "and great courage to come into our territory to return what was precious to us." By now, more people from the camp had arrived, including women and children who were clearly Little Wolf's extended family. His aunts and cousins surrounded him with hugs and tears, while his grandmother, an elderly woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, examined his injuries with the practiced skill of someone who'd tended many wounds over the years. Little Wolf's mother's sister, a woman in her 30s with the same intelligent eyes as the boy, approached Sarah May and took her hands, speaking rapidly in Comanche. Standing Bear translated her words. "She says thank you for saving the life of her nephew. She says you are now family to our people, and you will always be welcome in our lodges." Over the next hour, Will and Sarah May found themselves welcomed into the Comanche camp with a warmth and hospitality that contradicted everything they'd been told about Indian hostility toward whites. They were offered food and drink, and many tribal members approached to express their gratitude for returning Little Wolf safely. Through Standing Bear's translation, they learned more about what had happened during the attack that had separated Little Wolf from his people. The buffalo hunters had been operating illegally on Comanche land for weeks, killing not just buffalo, but also the deer, elk, and other game that the tribe depended on for food. When Gray Eagle's hunting party had encountered them and demanded that they leave, the hunters had responded with violence. The attack had been unprovoked and brutal, with the hunters using high-powered rifles to fire from concealment. 2 Comanche warriors had been killed immediately, including Little Wolf's uncle, and several others had been wounded. In the chaos of the battle, Little Wolf had become separated from the group and had fled into the wilderness. Gray Eagle and the other survivors had searched for days, but the vastness of the territory and Little Wolf's wandering path had made him impossible to find. They'd eventually returned to the main camp to organize larger search parties, but after 2 weeks, with no sign of the boy, most people had begun to assume he was dead. The joy and relief at his safe return were overwhelming. Standing Bear explained that children were considered the most precious treasures of the tribe, representing not just the future of the people, but the continuation of their culture and traditions. Losing a child was a tragedy that affected the entire community, and having one restored was cause for celebration by everyone. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the Thompsons were expected to stay for a feast in their honor. Standing Bear explained that returning a lost child was considered one of the highest honors in Comanche culture, and the entire band wanted to participate in celebrating their generosity and courage. Preparations for the feast began immediately, with women preparing traditional foods and men organizing games and competitions to mark the occasion. Sarah May was invited to participate in the women's activities, learning about Comanche cooking methods and cultural practices that fascinated her. Will found himself in discussions with the men about everything from horse breeding to weather patterns, discovering that they had more in common than he'd ever expected. The feast that evening was unlike anything Will and Sarah May had ever experienced. The entire camp gathered in a large circle around several fires, with the Thompsons seated in positions of honor next to Standing Bear and the other tribal elders. The food was abundant and delicious: roasted buffalo, venison, wild turkey, and various native plants prepared in ways that brought out flavors the Thompsons had never experienced. But more impressive than the food was the sense of community and family that permeated the gathering. Children moved freely among the adults. Elders told stories that captivated listeners of all ages, and everyone participated in songs and dances that had been passed down for generations. Despite the language barriers, Will and Sarah May felt welcomed and included in a way that touched them deeply. Little Wolf stayed close to Sarah May throughout the evening, and with Standing Bear translating, he told the assembled crowd the full story of how she'd found him, cared for his wounds, and convinced her father to help him return home. His words brought tears to many eyes, and several people approached Sarah May to touch her hands or speak words of gratitude that needed no translation. As the night wore on, Standing Bear stood and addressed the crowd in Comanche, his words carrying the weight of authority and ancient tradition. When he finished, he turned to the Thompsons with an expression of profound respect. "I have told my people that you have brought great honor to our band today," he said. "You risked your lives to return our child, treating him not as an enemy, but as one of your own family. This kindness will not be forgotten as long as grass grows and water flows." "We only did what anyone with a heart should do," Sarah May replied. "Little Wolf needed help, and we were able to give it." Standing Bear's smile deepened. "Not anyone would do this. Most of your people fear us, and most of my people have learned to distrust yours. But you have shown that the heart can be stronger than fear, that kindness can bridge the gaps that hatred has created." The chief paused, looking thoughtful. "Tomorrow we will show you how the Comanche people honor those who have honored us." When Will asked what he meant, Standing Bear simply smiled mysteriously and said they would understand in the morning. The Thompsons were given a comfortable teepee for the night, and despite the unfamiliarity of their surroundings, they both slept deeply, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day and comforted by the obvious safety and hospitality they'd been shown. They were awakened before dawn by the sounds of activity throughout the camp. Voices called out in the pre-dawn darkness, horses whinnied and stamped, and there was a general sense of preparation and anticipation that suggested something significant was about to happen. When they emerged from their teepee, they found Standing Bear waiting for them with 2 saddled horses, both beautiful animals that had obviously been selected with care. "Today you return to your home," he said with ceremony in his voice, "but you will not travel alone." As the sun rose over the valley, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Will and Sarah May found themselves at the center of the most extraordinary procession in the history of the Texas frontier. Nearly 200 members of Standing Bear's band had prepared to escort them home, all dressed in their finest clothing and mounted on their best horses. Warriors wore elaborate war bonnets with trailing eagle feathers, their faces painted with symbols that told stories of their achievements and spiritual power. Women rode in beautifully beaded dresses, their hair adorned with silver ornaments and colorful ribbons. Children sat on painted ponies beside their parents, their eyes bright with excitement at being part of such a momentous occasion. The sight was breathtaking and overwhelming. The Comanche riders stretched out in a long column that seemed to fill the entire valley, their colorful clothing and decorated horses creating a spectacle of beauty and power that few white people had ever witnessed. "Chief Standing Bear," Will said, clearly struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "This is incredible, but you don't need to—" "We do need to," Standing Bear interrupted firmly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "What you did for Little Wolf, you did for all of us. A Comanche child belongs to the entire tribe, not just to his parents. By saving his life and returning him to us, you have saved a part of our future." The procession began to move, and Will and Sarah May found their wagons surrounded by the magnificent Comanche riders. It was a sight that would have terrified most frontier settlers, but Sarah May found it beautiful and deeply moving. The dignity and pride of these people, the obvious love they felt for their children, and their profound respect for family and community were things she'd never expected to see in those she'd been taught to consider savage enemies. As they traveled across the prairie, Standing Bear rode beside their wagon, sharing stories about Comanche history and culture that gave the Thompsons insights into a world they'd never imagined. He told them about the great chiefs who had led the tribe through generations of conflict and change, about the spiritual beliefs that connected them to the land and to each other, and about their hopes for a future where their children could live with dignity and respect. "We are not the savages your people believe us to be," he said at one point, his voice carrying both sadness and pride. "We love our families just as you do. We mourn our dead, celebrate our children's achievements, and dream of better times ahead. We laugh and cry and hope, just as all people do. The only difference is that this land has been ours for countless generations, and we fight to protect it for our children." Sarah May found herself deeply moved by these words and by everything she'd observed during their stay in the Comanche camp. She'd grown up hearing stories about Indian raids and attacks, tales of brutality and savagery that had shaped her understanding of native peoples as something less than human. But her experiences with Little Wolf and his people had shown her a completely different reality. She'd seen the same love between parents and children, the same concern for community welfare, the same basic human emotions and values that existed in white settlements. The Comanche people weren't the monsters of frontier legend. They were human beings trying to protect their families and preserve their way of life in the face of overwhelming change and pressure. By midday, they could see familiar landmarks that marked the approach to Thompson property. The oak tree, where Sarah May had first found Little Wolf, was visible in the distance, and beyond it, the modest buildings of their ranch home came into view. As they drew closer to the ranch, Standing Bear called a halt to the magnificent procession. He spoke briefly to the assembled riders in Comanche, then dismounted and approached the Thompsons' wagon with ceremonial dignity. "We will go no further," he announced, "but first we have gifts for you." What followed was one of the most extraordinary scenes in the history of the American frontier. One by one, members of the Comanche band approached the wagon to present gifts to Will and Sarah May. The offerings were both beautiful and meaningful, representing not just material wealth, but the deep gratitude and respect of an entire community. There were blankets woven with intricate patterns that told stories of tribal history and legend. There were pieces of jewelry made from silver, turquoise, and other precious materials, crafted with skill that would have been admired in any civilized city. Carved wooden items showed the artistic talents of their makers, while decorated pottery demonstrated both practical skill and aesthetic sensibility. Weapons were presented as well, not as tools of war, but as symbols of respect and trust. Standing Bear himself presented Will with a beautifully crafted bow, explaining that it represented the hunter's skill and the warrior's courage. Little Wolf's father gave Sarah May a small knife with an intricately carved handle, telling her through translation that it would always remind her that she had the heart of a true warrior. But the most precious gifts were the personal items that represented family history and emotional connections. Little Wolf's aunt gave Sarah May a necklace that had belonged to her own grandmother, a piece of jewelry that represented generations of family tradition. Standing Bear presented Will with a peace pipe, explaining that it was reserved for those who had proven themselves to be true friends of the Comanche people. The gift-giving ceremony took nearly 2 hours, and by the time it was finished, the Thompsons' wagon was loaded with treasures that represented not just material wealth, but the profound gratitude and respect of an entire community. Each gift came with a story, an explanation of its significance, and an expression of appreciation for what the Thompsons had done. Little Wolf, who had ridden with the procession on a beautiful painted pony given to him by his grandfather, approached Sarah May for a final goodbye. Through Standing Bear's translation, he told her that he would never forget her kindness, and that he would tell the story of her courage to his children and grandchildren for as long as he lived. "You will always be welcome among our people," Standing Bear said as he prepared to lead the procession back toward their territory. "If you ever need help, if you are ever in danger, you need only send word to the Comanche, and we will come to your aid." As the magnificent procession prepared to depart, Standing Bear had one final message for the Thompsons. "What happened here will be remembered," he said solemnly. "The story of the white girl who saved a Comanche child will be told around our fires for generations to come. And perhaps, if more people on both sides could find the courage to see beyond fear and hatred, there could be peace between our peoples." The Comanche riders began to move away across the prairie, their departure as impressive as their arrival had been. Will and Sarah May stood in their yard, surrounded by the incredible gifts they'd received, watching until the last rider disappeared beyond the horizon. That evening, as they sat on their porch examining some of the beautiful items they'd been given, father and daughter reflected on the extraordinary events of the past week. "Sarah May," Will said finally, "what you did, bringing that boy into our home, insisting that we help him, that took real courage. More courage than most people ever show in their entire lives." "I just did what felt right, Papa. He was a child who needed help." "That's exactly why it took courage. It would have been easier, safer, to turn away. Most people would have, and no one would have blamed them for it." Sarah May was quiet for a moment, fingering the necklace that Little Wolf's aunt had given her. The beadwork was incredibly intricate, and she could see that it had been made with great care and love. "Do you think things could really change, Papa? Between whites and Indians, I mean?" Will considered the question carefully, looking out at the prairie where the Comanche procession had disappeared. "I don't know, darling. There's been so much fighting, so much distrust on both sides. The forces of history and politics are powerful things, and individual acts of kindness can't always overcome them." He paused, thinking about what they'd experienced over the past few days. "But what happened here gives me hope. If a 16-year-old girl and a lost Comanche boy can bridge that divide, if their story can move 200 people to travel across dangerous territory just to show their gratitude, then maybe there's reason to believe that understanding is possible." No word of the extraordinary events at the Thompson Ranch spread quickly throughout the region, carried by traders, travelers, and anyone else who had witnessed or heard about the remarkable procession of Comanche riders. The reactions were as varied as the people who heard the story. Some criticized Will and Sarah May for harboring an Indian child and consorting with a Comanche war party, seeing their actions as dangerous precedents that could encourage Indian aggression. These critics argued that the frontier was no place for sentiment, that survival depended on maintaining clear distinctions between friend and enemy. Others, however, praised the Thompsons' courage and humanity, seeing in their actions a possible path toward peace and understanding on the frontier. These supporters pointed out that violence had failed to solve the Indian problem, and that perhaps compassion and respect might succeed where force had failed. The story reached the attention of territorial officials, including the Indian agent responsible for relations with the Comanche bands. Initially concerned that the Thompsons might have violated federal policies regarding unauthorized contact with hostile Indians, the agent changed his position when he learned the full details of what had occurred. Here, he realized, was a genuine example of successful diplomacy between whites and Indians, something that had been all too rare on the American frontier. The agent wrote reports to his superiors in Washington, recommending that the Thompson incident be studied as a model for future Indian relations. More importantly, the story spread among both white settlers and Indian bands throughout the region. It became a symbol of hope, proof that the barriers of race and culture could be overcome by individual acts of compassion and courage. In a time when hatred and violence seemed to dominate relations between the two peoples, the story of Sarah May and Little Wolf offered evidence that another way was possible, Standing Bear proved to be true to his word about remembering the Thompsons' kindness. Over the months that followed, Comanche riders would occasionally appear at the Thompson Ranch, not to threaten or raid, but to check on the welfare of their friends and to maintain the bonds of friendship that had been established. These visits helped establish the Thompsons as neutral parties in the ongoing conflicts of the frontier, people who could be trusted by both whites and Indians. This unique status proved beneficial in practical ways, as Comanche knowledge of weather patterns, water sources and game movements helped Will improve his ranching operations, while Thompson trade goods found their way to the Indian camps. Through carefully arranged exchanges, the relationship also provided security for the Thompson Ranch. Word spread among all the Plains Indian tribes that the Thompsons were under Comanche protection, and this knowledge helped keep their property safe from the raids that plagued other frontier settlements. Sarah May maintained contact with Little Wolf as he grew from boy to young man, and their friendship became a living symbol of the possibility for understanding between different peoples. When Little Wolf reached adulthood, he often served as an interpreter and mediator in disputes between whites and Indians, using the trust and respect he'd earned from both communities to help prevent conflicts before they could escalate into violence. The skills he'd learned during his time with the Thompsons, including improved English and knowledge of white customs, made him valuable as a cultural bridge. His personal story of rescue and friendship gave him credibility with both sides, allowing him to speak with authority about the possibility for peaceful coexistence. The necklace given to Sarah May by Little Wolf's aunt became one of her most treasured possessions. She wore it on special occasions throughout her life, and it served as a constant reminder of the extraordinary events that had changed her understanding of the world and her place in it. Years later, when Sarah May had married and had children of her own, she would tell them the story of how she'd found a lost Comanche boy under their oak tree, and how that simple act of kindness had opened her eyes to the common humanity that connected all people, regardless of race or culture. The oak tree itself became something of a shrine and landmark in the region. Travelers would stop there to rest and reflect on the events that had taken place beneath its spreading branches. Local people began calling it the Peace Tree, and it came to symbolize the possibility for understanding and cooperation between different peoples. Will Thompson lived to see many of the changes that came to the Texas frontier in the following decades. The Indian Wars gradually came to an end, reservations were established, and the wild frontier gave way to more settled agricultural communities. Throughout these changes, he often reflected on the role that his daughter's simple act of compassion had played in demonstrating that conflict wasn't the only option available to different peoples. He watched with pride as Sarah May grew into a remarkable woman, known throughout the region for her fairness, compassion, and ability to see the best in people regardless of their background. The lessons she'd learned from her encounter with Little Wolf shaped her approach to every relationship and challenge she faced in life. As for Sarah May herself, the events of that April day in 1878 remained a defining experience throughout her life. She never forgot the lesson she'd learned about looking beyond surface differences to see the common humanity that connected all people. The courage she'd shown in helping a frightened child grew into a lifelong commitment to standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult or unpopular. When she eventually married a neighboring rancher named James Patterson, Sarah May made sure that their wedding celebration included Comanche guests, including Little Wolf, and members of his family. The sight of Indians and whites celebrating together was unprecedented in that part of Texas, and it reinforced the reputation of the Patterson Ranch as a place where all people were welcome. Sarah May and James raised 4 children, and each of them grew up hearing the story of their mother's encounter with Little Wolf. They learned to see all people as fundamentally the same, regardless of race or culture, and they carried that lesson into their own lives and relationships. The story of Sarah Mae Thompson and Little Wolf was passed down through generations in both white and Comanche communities. For whites, it served as an example of Christian charity and human decency, triumphing over fear and prejudice. For the Comanche, it was a tale of honor and gratitude, demonstrating the proper way to respond to kindness and generosity. In later years, historians would point to the Thompson-Comanche friendship as an early example of successful cross-cultural diplomacy on the American frontier. Scholars studied the incident as a model for how understanding and cooperation might have replaced conflict and violence if more people on both sides had shown similar courage and compassion. But for those who knew the story intimately, who had lived through those extraordinary days, or heard first-hand accounts from participants, it was much simpler than any academic analysis could capture. It was the story of a 16-year-old girl who saw a hurt child and decided to help, regardless of what others might think or what dangers might result. It was the story of a father who trusted his daughter's judgment and found the courage to support her decision, even when it meant risking everything he'd worked to build. It was the story of a lost boy who discovered that kindness and humanity could exist even among people he'd been taught to fear. Most of all, it was the story of 200 Comanche riders who traveled across dangerous territory to honor a simple act of human decency, demonstrating that gratitude and respect could transcend the boundaries of race and culture. The gifts that filled the Thompson yard on that remarkable day represented more than material wealth. They were symbols of hope, proof that the barriers between people were not insurmountable, that understanding was possible even in the midst of conflict and mistrust. The legacy of that extraordinary day lived on in the families and communities touched by the story, inspiring others to look beyond their prejudices and fears, to see the humanity in those they'd been taught to consider enemies. It was a lesson that remained relevant long after the frontier had disappeared and the old conflicts had faded into history. In the end, the most important gift that changed hands during those remarkable events wasn't any of the beautiful items presented by the Comanche riders. It was the gift of understanding, the recognition that people of different races and cultures could find common ground in their shared values of family, love, and respect for human dignity. The story of Sarah Mae Thompson, the cowboy's daughter who helped a lost Comanche boy find his family, became more than just a tale of frontier kindness. It became a testament to the power of individual courage to change the world, one act of compassion at a time. And in a land too often marked by violence and hatred, it stood as enduring proof that love was stronger than fear, that understanding could triumph over prejudice, and that the simple decision to help a child in need could echo through generations, inspiring others to choose compassion over conflict. This incredible tale reminds us that in a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, it takes just one person with the courage to see beyond differences and extend a helping hand to change everything. Sarah Mae's simple act of compassion didn't just save one boy's life. It bridged two worlds and showed that humanity knows no boundaries. When we choose kindness over fear, understanding over prejudice, and love over hatred, we create ripples that can spread far beyond what we ever imagined possible. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power we all have to make a difference, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories from history, and share this tale with someone who needs to hear it today. After all, we never know when our own simple act of compassion might change the world.